Let me introduce myself. I'm also Andrew. We're going to be looking at Genesis 22, and we're going to be reflecting on that in the sermon as well. It's also on the inside of your service sheets. We've actually been going slowly through Genesis last year, and we've got to this chapter, but we're restarting now, and you'll hear the connection with our first reading, because we heard about an oath made to Abraham in Hebrews, and this is where the oath is made back in the days of Abraham. So let me read. It's from Genesis chapter 22, and I'll read from verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went, both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide," as it is to this day. On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abram a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. And I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. And Abraham lived at Beersheba. Now, one of the old pupils at Eltham College, we go to Eltham College in the afternoon for our service there, and the most famous of all their old pupils is a guy called Eric Liddell. And the school like to make the most of this connection, and if you go there, the sports hall is the Eric Liddell Sports Hall, and if you go to the chapel, there's a picture of him in the stained glass window and so on. And the reason this guy, Eric Liddell, is famous, perhaps he's not famous to you, but they try and make out that he's famous. He's quite famous. The reason he is famous is because he was in a film, or his life was depicted, rather, in a film called Chariots of Fire. And the film is a great film. I've watched it quite a few times, especially with the kids. And it's all about the 1924 Olympics. And it's a contrast between 2 runners. This guy, Eric Liddell, and another runner called Harold Abrahams. And the contrast is really not just 2 people, but 2 ways of living, 2 approaches to life. So there's this guy, Harold Abrahams. This is the real one, not the one in the film. And he's a very driven man. And at one stage in the film, he declares this, and it kind of sums up what he stands for. In 1 hour's time, I will be on the track, and I will have 10 lonely seconds. That's how long it takes to run 100 meters. I will have 10 lonely seconds to justify my whole existence. And then he says, but will I? And you can sense, the tension there, everything hanging on whether he wins the race. Everything rests on his performance, and it's a very exhausting way to live, as we see in the film. Whereas the contrast is with Liddell, on the other hand. He has a faith in God, which kind of means his identity is not built on flimsy things like achievements, but rather on a relationship which is settled and secure and unmoving. And at one point in the film, Liddell says this, I believe God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. Sometimes I do it in a Scottish accent, but I thought I'll just spare you that today. He also made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. And one writer made this comment kind of about the contrast between these two runners as they're portrayed in the film. And he said this, Harold Abrahams was weary even when he rested. This is the driven guy. Whereas Eric Liddell was rested even when he was exerting himself. And that's a good summary of what the whole film is about. These two runners, two approaches to life. Now, today we are looking at that chapter, Genesis 22. It's one of the most famous passages in the Bible. You probably know the story. And it's a passage where Abraham is tested. And he's tested by God to the limit. And you'll see in the passage, he comes through, he nails it, he comes through with flying colours. And there's a way of reading this passage which could lead us to a kind of Harold Abraham's level of stress. Is God going to put me through that kind of scenario sometime? Am I going to have 10 seconds on which everything depends? And if you think that, it is a terrifying way to live. But I'm going to suggest that if we read the Bible properly, if we read the Bible the way God wants us to read it, it will actually have the opposite effect on us. And I'm convinced that the right way to read this passage is a bit like how we watch the World Cup, if you watch the World Cup. So it's possible to watch the World Cup for the purpose of learning and imitation. I see the football skills and the strategy, and I want to copy them. Actually, you can do that, and there's things to learn, but that's not the main reason that we watch the World Cup. The main reason, obviously, is so that we root for our team and hopefully celebrate in their victory, especially if you're Argentinian. And that's what we're going to do as we read about Abraham and his victory here. We're going to say, go Team Abraham. And ultimately, as you're going to see, we're going to say, go Team Jesus. We're going to see that Jesus is the one who this passage points towards. Abraham's obedience here ultimately points us to Jesus' obedience. And I'm praying that this passage will actually be very freeing to us and help us embrace the Liddell approach to life with security and joy and freedom. Because this is such a significant passage in the Bible, for the first time ever, I'm going to preach it 3 times. So the next 3 weeks, not the same sermon, but the same passage, and because there's such depth and riches in it. So if you're thinking, oh, but we didn't touch on that, come back next week and the week after. And there'll be a Q&A as well after this, if you've got puzzles remaining and comments. So we've got 2 points today, and here they are. God's servant is tested to the limit and passes. And then the second point, therefore God's salvation purposes are guaranteed. That's where we're headed, and we'll begin at the beginning. God's servant is tested to the limit. So let's read from verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. And this, it comes as a bolt out of the blue for us, and it really came as a bolt out of the blue for Abraham. And we're meant to feel the shock of this moment. God has never asked any human being anything like this before, and he doesn't do anything like this again, really. It just comes completely out of left field. And the challenging and the strange nature of this test is immediately underlined. So the strangeness of the command is emphasized by those opening words where it says, after these things. And it's pointing us back to what has just happened in chapter 21. Because in chapter 21, Abraham, aged 100, and his wife, Sarah, aged 90, finally, after 25 years of waiting on God's promise, finally they receive Isaac, the child of promise. And it's a great moment. Now in their hands, you can imagine, they are holding in their hands the child on whom all God's purposes for the world will be fulfilled. Don't drop him. That's the key. Everything rests on this child. And in that same chapter 21, Ishmael leaves and heads down to Egypt and is out of the picture. So Isaac is effectively Abraham's only son now, certainly his only heir. And now in chapter 22, bizarrely, God tells Abraham to sacrifice the one hope for humanity, the inheritor of all God's promises. And it's not just the strangeness of this test that is highlighted here, but also just how challenging it's going to be. Take your son. And I guess if you're a parent here, you will just feel the weight of that. Surely your child is the most precious thing you have. And then it goes on, take your only son. He's all Abraham's got. And God says, yeah, that one. Your only son. And then he's called by name, as if Abraham needed clarification. Take Isaac. And then finally, the one whom you love. Yes, okay, Lord, I get it. I see what you're saying. You're kind of rubbing it in now. I get that you want me to sacrifice the most precious thing imaginable. I get it. I guess as we hear this, immediately some of us are raising all sorts of questions about the ethics, the right and wrong of what's going on. Is God some kind of monster demanding child sacrifice? And I'll just make a couple of comments about that. Firstly, the Bible consistently and unambiguously condemns child sacrifice. In fact, the guy who's writing this, Moses, the same writer, goes on to describe how if an Israelite follows the practices of the nations around them in sacrificing a child, this is Leviticus 20, that Israelite will receive the death penalty. God hates child sacrifice, and that is very clear right from the start of the Bible. And incidentally, as readers, we know from the first sentence what Abraham doesn't. We know that God is testing Abraham. Abraham doesn't know that. We know that. And that we know that this isn't something ultimately that God wants him to follow through on. And in that sense, the drama of the chapter isn't, will Isaac be sacrificed? The drama is much more, will Abraham be prepared to sacrifice Isaac? Will he pass the test? That's really what's at stake here. It's a test. And it's also significant, and we'll think more about this next week, how unconcerned the writer is with this whole question of whether it's legitimate for God to ask such a thing. So we immediately ask, what right does God have to demand this? Is he immoral to suggest it? But actually, if we've been reading Genesis from the beginning and from chapter 3, we will know that the penalty of sin is death for all sinners. And therefore, God can require the life of a sinner at any time, no questions asked. Absolutely no injustice on God's part when he does that. So the real question should be, why does God graciously keep giving us more days to live when we don't deserve it? That's the shock in Genesis, and it should be the shock for us. Another day, Lord, thank you. So, as we've seen, God gives Abraham this very strange and this very challenging test. So how's he going to respond? Look at verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac, cut the wood for the burnt offering, arose and went to the place of which God had told him. So an interesting detail there. He rises early in the morning, verse 3. And it was making me wonder, actually, whether perhaps this was a way of avoiding that excruciating conversation with his wife, Isaac's mother, Sarah. Just imagine how that conversation was going to go. We're actually not told anything about that. This is pure speculation. In fact, I guess if this was a modern novel or if it was a film, that would be where the focus would be, that Abraham's inner turmoil, his psychological wrestling. But do you notice that that's not what this passage is interested in at all? The emphasis here is completely on what Abraham does, his uncomplaining, immediate obedience. And Abraham's life has had various wobbles of faith, and we've seen that in our Genesis series. He's been cowardly, he's been foolish. But here, in this climactic final episode of the account of Abraham's life, he is resolute, he's unwavering, and he obeys wholeheartedly. And verse 4, on the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. And the fact that it's a 3-day journey here heightens, I think, the challenge for Abraham. Think of all that time on the journey that Abraham had to reflect and to reconsider his decision. And yet every step is a step to keep going and obey. And then the narrative slows down and we get this very poignant scene with Abraham leaving his servants behind, trooping up the final climb up the mountain. Isaac is still unaware of what's going to happen, verse 7, until finally, verse 9, when they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there, laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac, his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife to slaughter his son, and he's got his hand raised, and we're wondering what is going to happen. It's just about to fall. And what a drama this is, because then at the last possible moment, God interrupts, and he calls off the test. And God says, verse 12, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And we breathe a sigh of relief, and the test is over, and the results are in, and Abraham has passed with flying colours. He's nailed it. He's done it. And we're going to think a little bit more about verse 13 and the substitute ram next week. But for now, the big headline is first, how God's servant is tested to the limit and passes. And then secondly, what flows out of that, namely that therefore God's salvation purposes are guaranteed. They're confirmed. So let's read that, verse 15. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that's on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Why? We get it again. Because you have obeyed my voice. And what we're seeing here is that because of Abraham's obedience, God's previous promises to Abraham are now expanded, they get bigger, and they're guaranteed, they get even more sure. So first they're expanded, they're enlarged. Previously, God had told Abraham to look up and count the stars. We did that in chapter 15. I'm told that on a clear night, it's possible in desert places to count perhaps 2,000 stars in the sky. And God says to Abraham, that is how many offspring you will have. And now God raises his bid, and he says he's going to multiply Abraham's offspring as the sand that is on the seashore, which I take it means so numerous. I mean, imagine just dripping sand through your hand, and you can't possibly count a handful of sand. And yet this is just so numerous that we couldn't possibly count them. And Abraham's now told that he's not just going to inherit the land as before, but one of his offspring is going to conquer it, not just living there, but ruling it. Your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And more than that, Abraham's promised that one of his descendants will be a source of blessing to all the nations of the world. And of course, as Christians, we know how that promise is fulfilled day by day. Jesus' kingdom spreading day by day across the nations. And I was reading about that on the BBC website this morning in Nepal. And crucially, Abraham's obedience means not simply that the promises are going to be expanded, but also they're going to be guaranteed. Because for the first time, God underlines his promise with a solemn oath. Did you notice that? Verse 15. By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord. So this is like the difference between a fiancé, like we've got some in this room, like Tom Brown or Ben Woodbridge, declaring their intention to commit to their beloved. And these men have done that in the last fortnight to their respective fiancés. And that's the difference between that and that moment next summer when each one of them will stand up and publicly make an oath to love their brides until death do us part. And from this point in the Bible, this oath becomes the source of Israel's security. So, for example, when the Lord is seeking to give assurance to Isaac in chapter 26, he says this, to you and to your offspring, Isaac, I will give all these lands, and I will establish, here it is, the oath that I swore to Abraham your father, because Abraham obeyed my voice, here in chapter 22. Or again, it's this oath which Joseph, later in the book, points his brothers to, chapter 50, to assure them that they will inherit the land. The Lord does the same thing in Exodus 33 and again in Deuteronomy 1 when he's giving his people assurance. Go up to the land I promised on oath to Abraham. Take possession of the land the Lord swore he would give to your fathers. And it's this same oath which we just had in our first reading in Hebrews 6. Because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised, what did he do? Well, he confirmed it with an oath. The point is that it's this oath on the basis of Abraham's obedience that is going to forever guarantee that God's purpose will be fulfilled. And we're told that what makes the difference here, specifically in verse 18, is that Abraham obeyed God's voice. And we're puzzled, what's such a big deal? Why is obedience to God's voice the deal breaker, or deal maker rather? Why is it that this changes everything? And this phrase, obeying God's voice, is an echo of what God said to Adam earlier in this book, in chapter 3:17. Because, Adam, you have obeyed the voice of your wife, it's the same verb, cursed is the ground because of you. And now, in chapter 22, the Lord says to Abraham, because you have obeyed my voice, this time God's voice, not the voice that's leading him away from God, what happens? I will surely bless you, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. So there's a sense in which Abraham's obedience here, it kind of answers to, or it reverses Adam's disobedience. Just as Adam's disobedience brought curse, Abraham's obedience is going to bring blessing. And of course, this pattern here is put in Genesis to prepare us for what's coming later in the Bible, the coming of the Lord Jesus, another believer who is also going to be tested to the limit and who will pass with flying colours. But of course, Jesus' testing was far, far harder. For a start, Jesus' testing began from the moment he came to earth. And it lasted not just a few days, but it lasted his whole life. Every day for Jesus, the same question, will he obey the Father's voice, whatever the cost, on that road towards the cross? And every day, Jesus kept going, trusting, never putting a foot wrong. Every day he knocked it out of the park, obeyed God. And there's a repeated phrase in this chapter which becomes a kind of catchphrase in the Bible. So in verse 1, God says, Abraham, and Abraham replies, here I am. And Abraham repeats this phrase again in verse 7. You probably heard the repeat when I was reading this echo. And again in verse 11. It's kind of the Genesis 22 theme tune, keeps recurring. And so from here on in the Bible, this Genesis 22 phrase becomes a catchphrase. It becomes the model answer for how obedient servants are to respond to the call of God. So when God calls Moses out of the burning bush, Moses says what? Here I am. Or when the Lord calls the boy Samuel in the temple, Samuel says, here I am. And then when in the New Testament, in Hebrews chapter 10, well, we read this. When Christ came into the world, he said, this is a deliberate echo, "Here I am. It is written about me in the scroll, I have come to do your will, my God." And Jesus takes these words of Abraham on his own lips and he says, look, here I am. I'm ready. I'm ready to fulfill everything that's been written of me, whatever the cost. And I've come to do it and to obey your will, O God. And of course, this commitment for Jesus involves ultimately going all the way to the cross. Now, in the history of the world, there have been two crucial moments at which the fate of all humanity, even the fabric of reality, lies in the balance. And both of these moments took place in gardens, and they're paralleled in that way so that we can notice and compare them. The first one, of course, is the Garden of Eden, when Adam decided to disobey God, and he effectively declared to God, "Not your will, but mine. I'm doing what I want." And in that moment, the whole world was plunged into darkness and death. And of course, the second crucial moment was also in a garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before Jesus died. And one writer, Jonathan Edwards, says this: "It was as if God was bringing Jesus to the mouth of a dreadful furnace, the furnace of God's righteous anger at human sin. It was as if God were saying, 'Here is the furnace into which you're going to be cast. Either your people must perish, or you must endure this for them.'" That's why Jesus was grappling with the cup of God's wrath in his prayers. What a terrible test Jesus had to face on that night. And the Bible says that he was sweating blood at just the thought of what lay ahead. His soul was overwhelmed to the point of death. And yet in the midst of this ordeal, Jesus says these words, "Take this cup of wrath from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." And Jesus does in that moment what Abraham's obedience points towards. In that moment, Jesus perfectly obeys his Father despite this terrible cost to him. And he does it for us. And of course, for Jesus, this is the climax of a whole lifetime of perfect obedience. And therefore, when he is tested to the limit and when he passes, God's salvation purposes are confirmed in an even more conclusive way, if that were possible. Because God replies by raising Jesus from the dead in a public declaration to the whole world that death has been defeated and there is now nothing which can now stop God from finally saving his people and ushering in his new creation. This is guaranteed. Paul puts it this way in Romans 5, "For as by the one man," this is Adam, "as by his disobedience, the many were made sinners, so by the one man, Jesus' obedience, the many will be made righteous." Now, we thought earlier about the two reasons someone might watch the World Cup. So somebody in the world probably watches it mainly for imitation reasons. You know, they want to copy what's going on. But hopefully, most of us are watching the World Cup for the other reason, for celebration reasons, rooting for our team. And I guess it's possible to read the Bible in such a way that we make it always about imitation. We read a passage and we think, go and do likewise. And if we do that, all the way through the Bible, we will miss what it's all about. It's actually possible even to read the account of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. You know that passage has a bit where the disciples fail to pray and they let Jesus down, and then Jesus goes off alone into the night to die for the sins of the world. And I've been in Bible studies where people come out from that passage and they say, well, it just goes to show that we need to be better and more faithful prayers than the disciples were, and not fall into that trap. And obviously, it's not a wrong thing to be a faithful, consistent prayer. But that is not what this is in the Bible for. The main thing we're to take away from seeing Abraham passing the test or seeing Jesus pass the test is surely just to enjoy it, just to celebrate it. He's just scored the winning goal in the World Cup final. What a saviour, what a hero. He's won the victory. Let's just enjoy it. Some of us will be aware of this guy. He's called Professor Jordan Peterson. I've mentioned him before, actually, in the sermon. He's not a Christian, but he's very interested, very captivated by Jesus and his teachings. And he thinks that imitating Jesus is what modern people, especially men, need to do to live better lives. And at one of his lectures on his 12 Rules for Life tour in 2019, he said this. You may have heard this quote. I have been asked many times by many people if I believe in God. I don't like this question. I generally respond by stating that I act as if God exists. But that is not sufficiently true. Who could do that? Who could conduct themselves with the moral exactitude and care necessary of someone who would dare to make that claim? So Peterson thinks that even to say we believe in God, we would need to live lives basically on a par with Jesus' life, morally speaking. So Peterson reads the Bible, he likes the Bible, but he reads it as if it's all about imitation, not celebration. And it's an enslaving way to live. He's living the life of Harold Abrams. Thankfully, and you may have noticed this if you've done work with children in Sunday school, children do not have this problem. They don't tend to have this confusion about how to read the Bible. In fact, in my experience, if you ask a child, what Bible story would you like to read today? They almost always say something like, oh, please can we have David and Goliath again? And then they say, can we act it out? I'll be David, you be Goliath. And they love it and they relive how God's people were stuck trembling and they were terrorized by this enemy who was too strong for him. And then up steps the hero, David. He wins the battle for the whole team and they all rejoice together and there's, whooping at the end. You see, that is the way to read the Bible. This is what Jordan Peterson and perhaps some of us need to grasp. We were thinking at the beginning about the difference there is between the Harold Abrams approach to life, 10 lonely seconds to justify my whole existence, and how different that is from the Eric Liddell approach. When I run, I feel God's pleasure. And the difference is basically the extent to which we have grasped the message of this chapter. My wife Josie has a memory of me saying to her, I actually don't remember this, and I talked to her this morning to get the details of it right, but apparently before her end-of-year exams when she was a university student, I said to her, don't worry, Jesus has already passed the only test that matters, so you can relax. And whether the details of this I can't confirm. Well, I can indirectly. But that phrase has somehow entered into our family as a kind of catchphrase. And especially at stressful moments, children, facing a test at school or something, it gets trotted out. Don't worry, Jesus has already passed the only test that matters. I think it's not just a catchphrase for those, exam moments. It is a catchphrase for every day of our lives. Sidney Pollack was a movie director and producer. He created some incredible films like Out of Africa and The Talented Mr. Ripley. And he died in 2008. He was aged 73. And when he was old and when he was sick and dying, he couldn't stop working right up to the end. And even when his family pleaded with him, they said, please, would you stop working? You're shortening your life and we want the final few months with you. He still couldn't help himself. And this is what one newspaper article said was the reason. Movie mogul Sidney Pollack says that although the grueling filmmaking process is wearing him down, he can't justify his existence if he stops. That is the same phrase as Harold Abrams used, justify his existence. You see, Pollack explained, this is a quote, every time I finish a movie picture, I feel I've earned my stay for another year or so. Now, I think Sidney Pollack was an extreme example of this, but how many of us start each day basically going out into the world thinking, we have something to prove. I've got to prove something to my parents. I've got to prove something to my colleagues. I've got to prove something to myself and to God. I've got to prove that I'm okay, that I'm a success, that I'm acceptable. And that is how we go out into the world. And for the Christian, that way of thinking can be over. You see, the Christian has the great privilege of starting every day with a different approach. Jesus has already passed the only test that matters, we say to ourselves. And we remember, he aced it. And that means that we can go out each day, we can work hard. Eric Liddell still ran very fast. We can do our best, but we're not doing it to prove anything. Like Liddell, we're doing it because we know God is already delighted in us, and we can just go out and live joyfully for him without everything resting on it. That is an incredible way to live and a real privilege we have. I'm going to leave a bit of quiet, and it's a time for us to reflect on what God is saying to us in this passage, and then we're going to have our prayers.